You're listening to episode 73 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
On this week's podcast, an interview I actually recorded back in early January with Bettina Elias Siegel. She's the author of Kid Food, The Challenge of Feeding Children in a Highly Processed World. Now, before we get into this show, I have to just say that the world has changed a lot since my conversation with Bettina. When Bettina and I spoke, kids were in school. They were playing soccer with their teammates on the weekends. Our lives, well, for lack of a better word, seem pretty normal. Of course, things have changed a lot since then. I suspect most of you are now at home working, helping your kids with schoolwork, and really just trying to make every day as positive and productive as possible. So with that in mind, the conversation I had with Bettina will be super relevant when all of our kids go back to school. So hopefully this spring or in the fall. And I will say, I hope everybody is doing okay. I really loved my conversation with Bettina. I know you're going to love it too. But the most important thing right now is that you're okay. We're all in this together and we're all here to support each other. And that's really the theme of this podcast, because Bettina will be here with so much important information that you can really put into your everyday lives. But in the meantime, let me just tell you a little bit about Bettina. She is a mom, 2 teenagers. She lives in Houston. She has been writing about children and food policy for almost a decade on her blog. It's called The Lunch Tray. And she also writes for publications including the New York Times and the Houston Chronicle. So her book, Kid Food, The Challenge of Feeding Children in a Highly Processed World, is filled with valuable resources. And we're going to talk about some of those on the show. The book has a lot of lessons on advocacy. That's what I love about it so much. And we talk about that on the show. And it gives a really good explanation of why so many of the foods presented to our kids today is highly processed and just not as healthy as we would like it to be. So I emailed Bettina the other day because I said, hey, our interview is finally going to go live, but I just want to find out what you've been up to, for the past few months. And she has shifted her advocacy a bit to make sure that the kids who are no longer in school, that's most of the kids in the U.S., can still access nutritious foods each day. So in early March, when only a few schools had closed due to the coronavirus, Bettina really wanted to know what would happen to school meals during a pandemic and what would happen to the millions, and I mean millions, right, of low-income kids who depend on those meals. And so she investigated the issue for Civil Eats, and she has since provided further updates on her blog, The Lunch Tray. And in the show notes from today's show, I will provide you links to those blog posts. And this is really cool. Just 2 weeks ago, Bettina also made an appearance in episode 5 of the new MSNBC series, What's Eating America, in which she spoke with host and chef Andrew Zimmern about the role of processed food in school meals. And you can access the entire 5-part series at msnbc.com/What's Eating America. I've seen a teaser on this show. I have not watched the show. And since I have a little more time in my life, since I've been kind of hanging out at home, I think I'm going to binge on What's Eating America because it really looks great. A friendly reminder, if you love the show, tell a friend about it and post a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to join the Liz's Podcast Posse page on Facebook so you are always the first to know what we have got cooking up on the blog, podcast, and beyond. Liz's Healthy Table is brought to you by my friends at superhealthykids.com, your one-stop shop for recipes, meal plans, cooking videos, and tips for feeding kids of all ages. Okay, if you are ready to change the world, or at least the kid food in our world, then you're going to really enjoy this episode. Bettina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I've wanted to have you on for the longest time. I've actually known you virtually, I feel like, for many years, from like the Meal Makeover Mom days.
Yes, we go back a long way virtually. I think this might be the first time that we're actually talking, though, which is so great.
I do think you're right. So for people who don't know you, I know you, but for people who don't know you, just tell everybody a little bit about yourself, where you live. You got a couple kids. We'll get into your blog and your book in a bit, but just give us the Bettina backstory.
Sure. As you said, I'm a mom of two kids. I have a 17-year-old son and a 19-year-old daughter, and I live in Houston now. And I used to be a lawyer. That's my training. When we had kids, I stopped practicing law and became interested in freelance writing, which I was doing for a while. And then my life took a kind of unexpected turn, and I wound up becoming a food advocate and someone who writes exclusively about children and food policy.
Mm. And I know we're going to talk a lot about policy and advocacy and, being like the best advocate you can for your kids. But I'm always curious, from anybody I talk to for the show, what does family dinner look like in your house? You're working, and I'm assuming your husband works. What does dinner time look like, and what are kind of those go-to recipes that you utilize, to get dinner on the table? Because kids, teenagers, they eat a lot of food.
Yes, they do. So it is true that, we both work, but I have the, good fortune of being able to work at home and on my own time. So, pulling off family dinner, I will say, is definitely easier for me than the mom or dad who's, in an office all day long. That makes it much harder, I would definitely say. But I pride myself on the fact that we really have had a regular family dinner almost every night since the kids came on the scene. And that was something that was really important to me and my husband to do if we could. And, so now I've one out of the house, so it's just three of us left. But, I really enjoy it, actually. I mean, some nights, of course, it's a hassle, but I actually like cooking. It's sort of relaxing for me. And I'm just always looking for those recipes that are kind of that sweet spot of, healthy and tasty, but don't take a whole lot of time, because on a weekday, I don't, want to devote a super long amount of time in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm. My son Simon is home from college. Josh lives in New York, so I'm an empty nester, and Simon's home on break right now. He goes out last night, as they do. And I threw a load of laundry in, which really irritates him. He actually does not want me to do his laundry, but I was like, oh, I gotta do it. I couldn't resist. It was such a weird feeling. And then I've been cooking for him. And I said, next year you're going to have an apartment in college. I want to teach you how to make 10, he's a good cook, but 10 recipes that you can whip together in no time that anybody can do. Now, and I'm thinking this isn't just going to be for college kids. This will be for everybody. So let me just tell you what I made last night, because I'm so excited about this. All right. So I roasted up, Tim's out of town, so it's just me and Simon. I roasted up 2 sweet potatoes. You can't lose with a sweet potato. They're so delicious. Then I opened up a can of Bush's baked beans, heated those up, and I topped the sweet potatoes with the baked beans. I added some shredded cheese. And then I opened a bag of pre-washed baby spinach and baby kale, kind of one of those combo bags, sauteed that, and that's what we had for dinner. We had our little veggies. Yeah, so it was vegan, vegetarian, whatever. Although there might have been some, I don't know, I think the beans were vegetarian. Sometimes they're not. But how easy was that? So healthy, so delish. Anybody can do it.
That's the thing. Right. It doesn't have to be super complicated. It really doesn't. And I think you have done such a good job teaching people that, which is so important.
That's what I'm going to do. Now I'm tackling college kids. That's going to be my next thing. Well, Josh, too, in New York. Oh, my gosh, the kid never cooks. He's 24. I'm like, you spending so much money on food. You got to cook at home more.
Right. I mean, I'm so pleased because my daughter is a sophomore in college this year and is in a dorm room, but the suite that she's in actually has a kitchen, and she's really making use of it, which I wasn't sure she would. And so it's actually really nice. She's really getting into cooking her own meals. Of course, we're still paying for a meal plan, which is sort of annoying, but so she kind of balances it out and sometimes is obviously eating with her friends in the dining hall, but it's kind of great that she has this opportunity and she's really running with it. I love it.
And what is she making?
She makes all kinds of stuff. One thing she loves is chickpeas that she sautés with different seasonings and spinach and stuff like that. I think she makes her pasta and, just all kinds of stuff, stir fries, but she's just kind of adventurous about it and really making use of it, which is wonderful. And my son too can cook as well. He certainly doesn't do it as often, but he's got the basic skills down, which I think is really important.
It's good stuff. Gotta, empower those kids. When I was a kid, we had home ec. My mom was a home ec teacher. I've talked about that on the show. We had home ec in school. We had those basic skills, right? And today we're really at a disadvantage because unless we're teaching our kids at home, they're certainly not learning how to cook in school. And for that matter, they don't even know how to address an envelope anymore. It's like, oh my gosh.
Right. I had home ec too. And I think we're kind of the last, generation to have gotten that instruction in school. And, as I have said before, it's like, I think having your kids leave your house without some basic cooking skills is almost like having them leave your house without knowing how to swim, because the food environment we live in now is really pushing them in unhealthy directions. And if you only can eat restaurant food or takeout or prepared food, you're really sacrificing your health. And as you said earlier, it also tends to be a lot more expensive. And so you just need to arm them with some just basic skills so that they can fend for themselves if they want to.
So this conversation reminds me of the show I did with Katie Morford. You know Katie, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, she's written a book called Prep, and it's all about cooking for college kids and young adults. So I will put a link to that in the show notes to remind everybody, in case you haven't listened to that episode, you should certainly tune in. So Bettina, you were a lawyer. Now you're a kid food advocate. How did you make that leap?
So it was really unexpected. And I think, first and foremost, it's because I became a parent. And I think a lot of parents listening can probably relate to this. There are all kinds of things in our world that we kind of notice, but we might not really focus on until we have children. And that can be anything from environmental concerns to, gun safety issues or whatever. And for me, I really started to see our food environment in a different way when I had little kids. And I was just so surprised at how hard it was to raise healthy eaters, despite my best intentions, how many things in their daily lives seemed to be pushing them toward junk food. So there were challenges like that outside my home. And then in my home too, I was kind of flummoxed. I had a kid who I thought was picky, and, that took me for a loop. So that was probably the first big turning point, was just becoming a parent. But I don't think I would have actually done anything with that, those emotions or those thoughts. It was really becoming involved in school food reform here in Houston in 2010 that really kind of sparked my interest in advocacy. And so that led me to start the Lunch Tray blog, which then talked about all of those things: school food reform, picky eating, why is your teacher handing out candy? What do you do about it? Just kind of the whole gamut of kid and food issues.
So tell me about the lunch tray, because I meant to ask you that at the beginning of the show. And then, of course, we got sidetracked with sweet potato. So tell everybody about your blog, The Lunch Tray, and then we will talk about your new book, Kid Food.
Sure. So I have been writing The Lunch Tray almost for 10 years now. I think May is going to be my 10th anniversary, which is incredible. I'll admit, I used to post like every single day. I was so just devoted to it. And it was just this, constant interaction with my readership. These days, just by virtue of other things going on and writing the book, it's a little less frequent posting, but it's basically, as I said, it covers everything related to children and food. In school and out is the tagline. But I would say that I've kind of evolved a bit as my kids have gotten older and as my knowledge has grown. It probably skews a bit more toward food policy issues than it does toward things like picky eating, which was of greater concern when my kids were young.
So your advocacy then is in school, but also outside of school, because, when we look at kids today, let's just look at the US, I feel like we're a little bit unique. We've got this sort of bombardment of junk food coming at us, not just kids, but adults too, whether it might be in school, the cafeteria, the classroom, the fundraisers, in restaurants, on the soccer field. There's just this like inundation. And, when we think about what it was like when we were kids, maybe the ice cream man drove by in the summer and you got like that little Dixie cup of ice cream. But today it's like this constant barrage. Like, what's up? Like, why is this happening?
I think that's a really fair assessment. I think our kids are bombarded with unhealthy food and also messaging about unhealthy food in so many contexts in their daily life. And I actually have a chapter in my book called Just One Treat, where I take a hypothetical like fourth grader through a typical day, just pausing at each point at which someone is either offering or selling that child unhealthy food, and then explain the reasons why, because it's not always that there are different reasons in different contexts. So when your teacher is passing out candy to keep control in the classroom, that might have to do with overcrowded classrooms, which are, I think far more crowded than they were when you and I were in elementary school. So that's a very different reason than why there might be junk food fundraising going on her school campus. That has to do with school underfunding. What's going on in the cafeteria? Well, we've certainly seen these really important nutritional reforms from the Obama administration. And I don't mean to downplay them. They're incredibly important and were a huge leap in improving school food. But parents still are seeing a lot of highly processed food in the cafeteria, what I call copycat food, which is food that is doctored to meet these new standards, but still have junk food brand names like Pop-Tarts and Cheetos and Doritos. So in each context in that chapter, I give you a little explanation of what's going on, what's the deeper picture in each case. But there's no question our kids really are exposed to and offered junk food. It feels like 24/7.
And why is that? I mean, well, just tell us about your book, Kid Food. And in the book, I know you explore this, but, why? How did we get here?
Right. So Kid Food is really my attempt to explain to parents and anyone else who's interested why it is so hard to raise healthy eaters in America today. And I think parents do feel that very keenly, that they feel like they're swimming upstream. And so my goal in the book is to answer why. Why are we swimming upstream? And there are really, I think, a lot of different forces at play. I mean, obviously, big food, corporate America plays an enormous role here in terms of the billions that they're spending to market unhealthy products directly to our children. And that's on top of the billions they're spending to market those same foods to us. So, and their presence in our school cafeterias and all of that. But I also felt like it would just be a little too easy to begin and end with corporate America. It would be easy to write a book that's just a screed against corporations. But the truth is, there are other factors too. And I think we need to take an honest look at what's going on. I think there are cultural factors. I think parenting styles have changed. We parents today tend to give our kids a lot more autonomy over food than prior generations. And I don't mean to sound like a scold, and I was a parent of young kids too, and I get the reasons why, but we are maybe not doing our kids so many favors if we're giving them the keys to the car all the time. Those cultural factors. And then I also really wanted to look at biological factors. Like, I think one strand driving children's unhealthy diets, not the only one, is this notion that kids are inherently picky. And I really wanted to look at, is that true? Is there a reason why we feel like we have to give them mac and cheese and that they have to grow into foods like broccoli? And I wanted to kind of dive into the science there and see what was going on. So it was my attempt to kind of address this from every perspective I could think of to give parents a full picture and then help parents think of how they might change that picture.
So let me ask you about that picky eater situation. And that is, we assume kids will be picky, but what did you uncover from your research and what do you share in the book about this issue of picky eating?
So, it is a complex question. I look at the science of early taste formation. And one thing that was really interesting to me is, and I didn't know anything about this before, is that for one thing, there's this thing called, as I'm sure you know, this thing called food neophobia, which is that all children, young toddlers, are going to exhibit at some period in their development a fear of new foods or a reluctance to try different foods, even if they've, prior to that period, been very open. And so I think if parents knew that was coming, that would be incredibly useful information for parents. Like, we know, for example, newborns don't sleep through the night. So we're not surprised when that happens. But I think not all parents are made aware, like, listen, you're going to go through this bump in the road where suddenly your child's going to seem like a picky eater. But if you know it's coming, you can ride it out much more confidently, as opposed to when I experienced that with one of my kids. I really got nervous, and I think it really changed the way I was feeding him for the worse. So that's one example of information that I share. And again, there's this issue of the autonomy we're giving children. If children have unfettered access to the pantry and they're just snacking all day, which is the case in a lot of homes, if your child's not arriving at the table hungry, that in and of itself can really compound selective eating behavior because they're just not going to be as willing to try new things because they're full of goldfish, and so that's an issue. We give children a lot more control over the foods that we buy and also the foods that we choose to serve at meals. That's just based on data. I'm not, just speculating about that. And again, if kids have that kind of autonomy, they're typically going to choose the old favorites or the kid-friendly chicken nuggety sorts of foods. And again, that can sort of constrain the opportunities they get to try new flavors and textures. So, lots of things going on there.
And I'm thinking too, just about, we can all relate to this, about the Lamaze classes you would take where you spent hours learning about how to give birth. And then you show up at the hospital and they're like, too late. We got to give you a C-section done, like, oh, but I wanted to, do it naturally. But yet all those hours, like, wouldn't it be nice if we could shift a few of those hours into really understanding what's going to happen when you get home with this little baby, and the food thing is just such a huge thing. Beyond breastfeeding, right? Or bottle feeding, it's like then when you have to start solids, there's just so much to learn. It's incredible. So you could see, where parents are like, he's picky, she's picky. And then boom, before you know it, mac and cheese is on the menu.
Absolutely. And another thing that I had learned from a book called First Bite, which I'd read a few years ago, and which I talk about in the book in more detail, is this thing called the flavor window, which again, I'm sure you're familiar with, but I knew nothing about this idea that kids are particularly receptive to new flavors starting, in just as soon as they start solids, basically, and that you can really expand their palate if you are very kind of dogged about giving them lots and lots of new flavors during that period. So exactly what you said, like all of this information would be so useful for parents, but I'm not sure that they're getting it, in the typical pediatrician's visit or in, as you said, like in birthing classes or something like that. It would be great if parents were armed with this beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, you mentioned this before, that you go into a supermarket. There's so many food options today. So when we were kids, they're just, we didn't really have a say in what was for dinner because there wasn't like a lot out there. You went to school with the bologna sandwich and that was the end of that. Cause believe me, I ate a lot of bologna sandwiches growing up and my mom was a great cook, but that's what you took to school. So it's just like, it's amazing when you think about sort of the evolution. And I also had this kind of window on food and nutrition, more of a European perspective, because my husband's British. And my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, they've got 2 kids. My niece Daisy has been on the podcast with my sister-in-law Karen. But, the whole food thing is so different over there. And it reminds me of, Tim and I were in Florida last week and we were eating at the breakfast buffet at the hotel. They had a ton of great food, but they also had the donuts and stuff like that. So I see this family sitting there. It was a mom and a dad and 2 kids. I don't know. The kids were maybe 10 and 12. And they're all sitting there quietly with good posture. And I see the little boy go up and he comes back. He's got this plate full of fruit. And then he comes back and he's got the omelet and everybody. I'm looking at them. I said to Tim, my gosh, look at these kids are eating so beautifully. And then I look at the little girl and she has literally piled her plate high with this weirdo looking fruit called rambutan. Looks like a lychee nut. It's kind of, yeah, literally, it's like these spiky things. They look like sea urchins almost, but it's like a fruit and you peel back this spiky looking skin and there's this fleshy fruit inside. But when I say her plate is piled high, I mean piled high. I'm like, this is so weird. And of course I walk by because I'm so nosy and they all have, accents. They're all from Europe. That's it. Probably French or German. I wasn't quite sure, but I was like, that explains it. I just it felt very European to me. Just looking at cultures are so different when it comes to food, right?
Right. And I allude to that somewhat in the book. In my appendix, I list that wonderful book, French Kids Eat Everything, which I thought was a great discussion of that, exactly the way these cultural factors also can really shape our children's diets. Absolutely.
Even the school lunch, if you go to France, maybe not England, because there's been issues there with their school lunch. And I do think our school lunch has come a long way here. But that being said, you can still serve a healthier chip. I'd rather, they serve fruit or vegetables with a dip, you know what I mean? Than like a low-fat chip.
So I would say, again, going back to like these cultural factors and countries like France, we just don't value our school meal program the way many other countries do, Japan and France being two really great examples. And I mean that in the most literal sense. We don't fund it the way they do. And so we can hardly complain when we see these beautiful lunches in other countries where kids are given ample time to eat and they're not given the Dr. Doritos and Pop-Tarts. It's in part because the society itself just greatly values these food traditions and they want to pass them on to the next generation, and they understand the importance of a calmly eaten, civilized and healthier meal. And we just don't fund our program the way we need to allow our own school food professionals, who are really, I think, for the vast majority, well-intentioned, really motivated people, to pull off the same kind of meals.
And, school lunch has come a long way for sure. And we'll talk a little bit more about that through the podcast. And I want to give people some sort of tips for being an advocate, to improve the school in their community, if the school food, in their community, if they're not happy with it. But this thought popped into my head, and this is something I've always said in all of the years that I was an advocate here in Lexington, Massachusetts, where I live, working really hard through my kids' elementary school years to improve the school food here. And that is that as a parent, you always want your school to have the best curriculum, right? The best math program, the best English program. And the curriculum's a really important thing. But yet when it comes to the food we serve our kids, whether it's in a classroom setting, in a cafeteria, or after school at a fundraiser, we don't have those same demands. And I feel like we as parents have the right to have all those same demands. I want the best curriculum, gold standard. I want the best food, gold standard. Because remember how I said earlier, we don't teach kids how to, cook or fill out the address put the stamp on an envelope. We're not teaching them those life skills. That's important to me. I'm horrible at math, I will admit it. But I got the life skills of the cooking, and that has thankfully served me well. I can double a recipe. That's kind of my math. But do you think that's like I'm naive here, or do you think that as parents we should sort of be demanding the same standards?
Well, that was one of the goals for writing Kid Food. First, I just want to kind of explain our children's food environment in all of these different contexts for parents, whether it's what's going on in your children's sports leagues to what's going on in the cafeteria. But a secondary goal for parents who are game for it, who are up for it, is to encourage some advocacy, because I think you're exactly right. I think parents would like to see a better meal program. But I think very few parents think about well, how would we achieve that? What would I have to do to bring that about? And because that really is happening at the federal level, it really needs to become an issue upon which we vote. We need to ask our elected officials about it. Let's get those questions in a town hall. Let's talk about it in presidential debates. That's how we would improve our lunch program, because it really is all happening in Congress. I mean, that being said, your district, your state can also be better funding your local meal program. That's possible. But I would love to see more widespread advocacy across the board.
Yeah. There's a big difference between a local community, a state, and then the federal, right? So there's, here in my town of Lexington, we've got 30,000 people, right? And, I remember years ago when, it's always when your kids end up at school and you walk in and you're like, what are they eating here? And what I was observing back then, now this was when Josh was probably in, let's say, kindergarten, right? Or first grade. He's now almost 25. So I'm going to date myself here. But I would go in and I would see that in the elementary school, they were serving a la carte foods, meaning the kids could pay extra. They were selling Skittles, candy, which I think was illegal. They were selling Hawaiian Punch, ice cream, Doritos, cookies. It went on and on. And I was observing children taking their lunch money and not buying lunch, but just buying the junk food. I'm like, what? Why is this being served to 7-year-olds? And, so that's where that local advocacy started to kick in. And today it's a completely different landscape. But, I had my ups and downs too, because I kind of went in there as the mad mommy. I was fired up. I was like, what is going on here? And that was not the right way to get into it. And I kind of took a breath and eventually, learned how to do it the right way. But maybe you can kind of give us some pointers on, let's talk local here, because it's one thing to say, we want to hear them discuss this in the presidential debates. Like, no, we're all like in our little towns all around the country. So what are like the do's and don'ts of being that parent who's concerned and wanting to see change, whether it be the cafeteria or the soccer field, you name it. So the fundraiser at the hockey games. So how do you bring about change? How can we be good advocates?
It's such a good question. And I don't mean to make it sound like, yeah, we can only be doing things at this sweeping national level. And in fact, I have a whole chapter just devoted to exactly this, which is parent-driven face-to-face advocacy. Because I agree with you. I think that is critically important. And it can reach into so many aspects of our children's day very effectively. If we can change the soccer snack and switch the sports drink to water, that alone is actually a really big change in our children's daily food environment and that those of their peers. So yes, I think it's super important. And so I have what I call my 14 rules for face-to-face advocacy. And I'm very frank about the fact that these are not coming from me from on high with my great expertise. It's really more like learn from my mistakes. These are the rules I often violated, and here's how they, that came back to bite me. And then also in that same chapter, I really profile a lot of very successful parent advocates and get their story and get their advice. And that's how I came up with these rules. And so just to give you some examples, the first one, it sounds like you violated it, and I certainly violated it, which is called don't be a fruitcake. And the reason why I use those exact words is because I once was given this little card with, how to be an effective advocate. And the idea being, if you're just one parent, you're going to be labeled a fruitcake.
Because like you're a weirdo, you mean? You're the weirdo.
Exactly.
You're the outlier. Okay.
Right.
Because I have to just tell you, in England, because my husband's British, fruitcake is like a beloved dessert. So.
Oh, it doesn't translate.
No. People in England will be like, but I want to be a fruitcake. Fruitcake's good. I can give it as Christmas gifts, and it's good on the shelf for 10 years. Come on now.
Right. That's so funny because my book is coming out in the UK in a few weeks, so they're probably going to read that baffled. But,
yes.
But the joke is, like, if you bring a friend, you're like a fruitcake and a friend. But if you're three people, now you're getting people's attention. And so the idea being strength in numbers. I do think that's probably the number one rule I would convey to parents. The more people you have in your corner, whether they're physically with you in that meeting or their names are on your petition or whatever it is, the more you can show, greater support than just you, the less likely you are to be written off as the crazy parent. And so that would be probably rule number one.
And Bettina, I like that. And I will just interject and say that after I got over my mad mommy crazy phase, I then formed the Healthy Lunch Task Force. And we went in with the clipboards and surveyed and observed, and we worked with the superintendent, and we were like a team. It was so important. So I'm so glad you're sharing that as like the first tip, because you're really not alone. There's other parents out there like you, right? Trust me. They're out there. You got to find them. You got to find them.
Exactly. And that might just be, casual conversations that you strike up with people. And, you're all standing there on the sidelines of the soccer field. You can sort of gently ask fellow parents how they feel, but it may take a little detective work on your end to find those allies. But I agree with you. I think a lot of parents are frustrated, but they just stay quiet and assume that they can't change the status quo. So I think that's awesome that you did that, and giving yourself a name of a task force, like all of that to convey, like, we mean business and there's more than just one of us, it's really good. Another tip I give is to find out if there might be a group already doing what you want to do, because sometimes that's the case. Like with school food reform, for example, you might not know that actually there is a group in your district working on it. So I give tips on like how to just make sure that you are not reinventing the wheel and might be able to glom on efforts with an existing group, because that's obviously a efficient way to go about it. Another tip I give is to take baby steps. Don't feel like you have to change things, overnight. And especially the bigger the goal, the more you're going to have to take baby steps. If it's trying to change what's going on in your cafeteria, you may not be able to do that in one fell swoop, but you might be able to set measurable, smaller goals. Like, I want to increase the number of salad bars, by this many over the next year, that kind of thing.
And can I ask you this, Bettina? Because when we first got into our task force, we did the whole baby step thing too. Like, we actually this was huge, actually. It felt like a baby step, but in hindsight, it was huge. We got recess moved to before lunch for most of the kids. Because when you move recess before lunch, It was a little bit of a hassle to rearrange schedules, but then the kids burn off steam. They come in hungry and they don't rush through lunch to get out the door, right? They kind of chill out. And the other thing we got was we got the a la carte out of the elementary schools, which was
huge.
That was huge. And, they sort of snuck a few things back in, which I was never happy about, but I had to let it go. But by and large, all of this junk food fest, and they were making money from it, trust me. And then the other huge thing we got ultimately, and this is something parents should be thinking about, is a lot of these schools that utilize third parties, whether it's Wits Inc or Sodexo, am I saying that right? Or Chartwells. Sodexo, yeah, Chartwells. It was a little brain thing there. And Chartwells, those are 3-year contracts quite often. And then when the contract runs out, they got to renew it or they got to look elsewhere. And we were able to get rid of one vendor and bring in another. And I was on the parent committee. I was the only parent that was on that committee to reassess Chartwells at the time. And we ultimately brought in Wits Inc. And it was incredible, and you're like, whoa, we really have more, you have more power than you think. You start with the baby steps and then right in front of you, there's an RFP for a new vendor and boom, you get to, be part of that decision-making process.
That is so impressive. And right. I mean, that's my belief, is that parents are an untapped source of power. And whether that's at the local level, and that can be as local as what's going on in your kid's classroom, all the way up to the national level, we are formidable if we join forces. So I think that's what I hope parents take away from the book.
Give me a few more tips then for being a good advocate. You talked about the baby steps and you talked about having allies. What are some other, and don't be mad like Liz was mad, but, take a breath, kind of take a step back, make a plan. But what are some other good tips from the book on being a good advocate?
So another really important tip, and this is one that I do think I actually adhered to my own rule and it really paid off, is to just be well informed about your issue. So school food is an excellent example, because that's an area where I think a lot of parents very understandably walk into a lunchroom, see something they don't like, and just start sounding off. And yet that's a particular area where it's so heavily regulated and so underfunded that the kind of changes you're asking for might just be completely pie in the sky. And that doesn't mean we can't improve school meals, but if you just start making crazy, demands that are just not practicable, you are immediately going to be discounted as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. And so if you have just a little knowledge about how that program works and what the obstacles are, then you can come in and be like a team player. You can express empathy for that school food professional you're dealing with. You can show them that you've done your homework, you get what they're, up against, and that will just change the dynamic entirely. And so the book only has one chapter on school food because I think that's as much as any parent really wants to read. But my goal is that at the end of that one chapter, you will have that knowledge so that you can be a well-informed advocate for that. But another example I give in the book where just a little information is so beneficial is candy rewards. It's very easy to go into the teacher or the principal and say, hey, stop handing out M&Ms, and I really want you to stop doing that. But if you could go in and say, look, here's data that shows that when you reward children with food, this is how it changes their relationship with food for the worse. Just having that information at your fingertips, it just will instantly kind of elevate that conversation and make you seem much more, again, informed and unemotional and logical. And that, I think, can just go a really long way.
Yeah. And then you can walk into with a list of non-food rewards or extra recess. I mean, what kid doesn't love extra recess as a reward?
Yes, exactly. And that's another rule, which is to be willing to, offer solutions and lend a helping hand, right? If you can go to a teacher and say, listen, you're handing out candy, but research actually shows that if, kids do a little movement break, that can be as effective in sort of restoring order, then you've given them a solution. Or similarly, if you're going to say, let's not have Rice Krispies treats for soccer snack, then, you've got to be willing to cut up fruit, So, right, you've got to always be willing to, I think, show that you're a team player and that you're willing to help out.
Yeah. And sometimes, you have to be a squeaky wheel. And you mentioned that even if you get let's say your kids play, Josh used to play soccer and then he'd go off to baseball. So Saturday was like a junk food fest because originally it was like oranges at halftime and then suddenly all this junk food showed up. I was like, where is this coming from? And so you had all the junk food, not to mention all the litter and the packaging. And then he would go off to baseball and then he'd eat more junk food there. I was at my wit's end. Again, years ago. So I ended up forcing my husband, who happened to have been the president of the local soccer club, the youth soccer club. And I said, Tim, we're writing a letter to the editor of the local paper, and it's titled, Bring Back the Oranges, Please. And it was all about junk food on the playing field. And it was this plea to the community, right? So the poor guy, I made him co-sign it with me. And I think I probably threatened him, like, I will never cook a meal for you again. You will go hungry. Your life is over. You will co-write this with me. So this thing appears in the paper, and I had so many parents come up to me and say, thank you. This was so great. Because I've been thinking the same thing. Like, I can't get my kid to eat lunch on a Saturday because they played soccer for half an hour and they're eating all the junk and drinking the Gatorade. And it's like, it's snowing out, for heaven's sake. We're in Boston. It's freezing all the time. So something like just a little letter to the editor, all these little things you can do, just, talking to the head of the soccer club and just saying, hey, like you said, going armed with information and just saying, can we just do water and fruit? It's easier on the parents. It's cheaper. And,
right.
The kids are not going to starve.
And in the context of soccer snacks, there's actually studies that show kids who participate in team sports are eating more junk food than kids who don't. And they're attributing it to those snacks and also the fact that they often eat fast food when they're, on the road or playing games, in stadiums and stuff like that. So that is, extraordinary. And we also know that kids typically are eating more in the snack and the sweetened sports drink than they're burning off on the field. So again, having that kind of data, I think, gets people's attention as opposed to just kind of being the angry, ranting parents,
But that's so interesting. Can you send me that study? Because I want to put that in the show notes, because that's fascinating to me. So here you have the kid athlete who's eating all this junk. And then the armchair athlete who maybe is, doing drama on the weekends isn't eating all that junk.
Crazy? Isn't that crazy? Yes. So that's all. I'll happily send you that study. And a lot of this information is in my appendix because I want parents to have that information. I want, in every one of these contexts, I try to arm you with what you need.
Mm-hmm. And there's also in schools the wellness policy. I think it started, was it 2004 or 6, where by law you have to have a wellness committee in your school, every school, if you participate in the National School Lunch Program. And then if you're a member of the wellness committee, you can really start to come up with, okay, we want to have recess before lunch, or okay, we want to add 5 minutes to the lunch 20 minutes that our kids currently get, or we're not going to sell a la carte to elementary schools. Like, that's where a lot of action happens with a wellness policy. And I'm pretty sure any parent can volunteer for that.
Yes. And so wellness policies were actually, you're right, they did start, I think, around 2004, and then they were strengthened really significantly as part of that Obama era school food legislation, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. It built in many more provisions into wellness policies that make them even stronger. And I have a whole section on that in the book because I agree with you. That can be a really great opportunity for parents to get involved in ways that can make real change. Now, I will say, with every example you just gave, longer lunch periods, moving recess, there can be these obstacles that are seemingly insurmountable. But I think that is a really great avenue for parents to be working with their administration and with, all of the stakeholders to try to tackle those really tough issues.
And it is so important too for parents who are advocating to go sort of with more a team approach, so that you're not just walking in as this parent task force, but that the task force is working with a teacher and a student and the principal. So there's other people involved. It's not necessarily just parents, because the teachers are at the front lines, and the cafeteria folks, they're at the front lines, and having them working with you is, to me, the magic.
Yes. And I think that's one reason why wellness policy committees can be so powerful, because by regulation, they have to include some kind of student representatives, educators, physical activity, educators, people from the community. The one that I served on here in Houston had people from our police department and our public health community. We had a really broad array of voices, and I thought that made it a particularly powerful committee and experience. So I agree with you.
Yeah, so being the squeaky wheel, it does have its ups and downs. And I know you've probably had some great victories. I'm imagining you had some bad moments too, where people got mad at you.
Yes.
And I'm sort of, if you share maybe some of your an up and a down, I'll share an up and a down with you too.
Okay, fair enough. So maybe one of my biggest ups, one of the victories I'm most proud of, I actually go into a little detail about it in the book because I just thought it would be inspiring to parents. And this was, just recap it very briefly here, but McDonald's wanted to put this nutrition education video, and I'm really using air quotes when I say that, into our schools. And it was horrible. I'll just leave it there. And I had a petition campaign against it that got picked up by the Today Show and the front page of the Washington Post. And we had such a great outpouring of dismay over this video that it actually got stopped in its tracks before it ever got to our schools. So that I would consider maybe my biggest up victory in parent advocacy. But yes, I've certainly had those moments where, everybody is upset with you and it can be really awful. So I'll give you an example of that. Not that long ago, actually, I read that my district was entering into an $8 million contract with Domino's to have Smart Slice pizza in our cafeterias. And Smart Slice is an example of one of those copycat foods where, yes, it does meet the nutritional regulations, but it's branded in such a way that you're still giving kids a very strong message that it's okay to eat this junk food every day. And so I had learned about this from a Facebook group of Houston ISD, Independent School District parents, who were very upset about it. And I therefore felt like I was among like-minded people and was sort of, ranting there about all of this junk food fundraising on our campuses, and people are setting up tables of, Chick-fil-A and all this unhealthy food to raise money. And isn't this terrible? And I only then realized that this was a particular group where they themselves were the junk food fundraisers. They were running them, and the only reason why they've been upset about the Domino's contract is they thought the money was coming out of our general fund. So in other words, I completely misread my audience. They then felt like I was judging them, and it was a very uncomfortable moment. Ultimately, I was very honest with them, and I said, listen, I get why you're raising money through junk food sales. I know that my district is underfunded. I think we could all agree it would be better if you didn't have to resort to those sales, but we'll just leave it there. But it was a very awkward for me where I was like, oh boy, I really put my foot in it. So
I can remember years ago, Josh was selling, instead of doing junk food to raise money for the school, they were selling light bulbs. It was when the eco-friendly light bulbs kind of started becoming popular.
Right.
So there's ways to do it, to look at, not necessarily having to sell, candy bars or whatever, but there's non-food things you can be selling. And I think people you have to be careful with the judgment thing, because it's not and I want everyone listening to realize this too. No one's judging. What I think what we're saying here is we just want what's best for our kids, right? We want the best sports program, the best curriculum in school, the best food. It's just, we just want them to be healthy. And there's ways to reach your end goal, whether it's fundraising or rewarding kids or whatever it might be, without necessarily, bringing food into the mix. And it's also very hard to define what's healthy, because somebody might say, well, what's wrong with pretzels, or what's wrong with Gatorade? Kids are sweating. Don't they need Gatorade? Well, yeah, but it's got all this sugar, maybe not, or artificial this or that. So it's hard to define. It becomes very personal. So maybe you just take, you just say water and fruit at soccer, and there's just kind of easy to figure that one out, right? Everybody likes fruit, and there's so many to choose from. So it can be tough.
Well, I want to definitely hear your up and down, but I'll just pause right there for 1 second, because I think you've really put your finger on something very important that I talk about in the book. The confusion about what is healthy, I think, is a huge driver of a lot of these problems that lead to our children's unhealthy diets. And I think that is an area where we can point our finger at corporate America very clearly, because I think the way our products are labeled, the way they're talked about in advertising, and all kinds of other reasons, we are all, I think, confused. And a lot of parents would say, well, what's wrong with low-fat Doritos and a Gatorade? And so, and I think we can really say that we can lay at the feet of big food. And I think that is driving a lot of these problems. But anyway, and now I want to hear about your up and down.
Gosh, lots of downs. Okay. So let me start with the up. So I had mentioned how we had Chartwells in our school system for many, many years. And they were just, besides this a la carte ridiculousness, it was just absurd how much junk food they were selling to 8-year-olds. We were just not happy. We felt like they were talking the talk, but not walking the walk. And so after a lot of review, I was asked, because their contract had run out or was about to run out. So the assistant superintendent, because again, I was working with everybody in the system, she said, Liz, we're forming a very, very small group of 4 people, 1 parent, me, the assistant superintendent, the head school nurse, and the head of our physical fitness program, the head gym, what do they call them? He ran the whole phys ed for the whole school system. So we're getting these, 4 people together. Will you be the parent to review these 3 big food service companies to figure out who we're going to bring in next? Maybe we'll stick with Chartwells. Maybe we'll try somebody else. We're going to consider Sodexo. I can't say it. Sodexo. Thank you. I'm so glad you're on the show, Bettina. Sodexo. And we're going to consider Wits Inc. Okay. They were sort of new to the scene. So I said, sure, I'll be on this committee. So the assistant superintendent, she hands me the RFP, right? Which stands for request for proposal. So request for proposal. She hands me the RFP booklets from each of these food service companies. And they must have been like, a foot thick, each of them, filled with pages upon pages of how great they are and all the foods they offer. And I start going through it. And I'm so stressed out because I'm we how on earth can I make a decision on who we should hire for this 3-year multi-million-dollar contract? We have how many, we have 7 elementary schools and 2 middle schools and a high school. I mean, we have a lot of kids. How do I decide that on paper, looking at their materials? So I went back to the committee and I said, I will only be on this committee if we get to go to various schools in the area and eat the food. We want to eat Chartwells food. We want to eat Wits Inc, right? We want to eat their foods and check them out. So we started going on field trips. It was actually kind of fun. And we ultimately met with these 3 purveyors and we ultimately chose Wits Inc. And it was intense, but we ended up with, I believe, for our community, a better company that really was listening. And, again, they're not perfect, but it was such a better fit for us. So that was a big win.
Absolutely.
To say to this group, but it's scary when you're like having to call the assistant superintendent and say, well, I kind of think we need to go on a field trip here. Otherwise, it's never going to work out. And she was cool with it. So that was really kind of fun.
And I was going to say, I think that's really smart to see the actual food, as opposed to just what's in that contract. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, you can't assess. And of course, when you go to these different schools, they're going to put on a good show for you. But one of them, no names mentioned, we went and they knew we were coming. And the food was all like beige food. I'm like, where are the vegetables? And Wits Inc actually blew us away. So we were like, and it was unanimous. It was really kind of exciting to go through that process. And so that was an up. A down would have to be when I first started that healthy lunch task force and we were meeting with the superintendent and we're going around the room and I was like fuming. I was so mad about the fact that they were, oh my gosh, they were cooking. What was it? There was so much trans fat. It was back in the day when trans fats were everywhere, but I would go into the kitchen and see what, how they were preparing cookies and they were using like Crisco. I was like, oh my gosh, it had all bubbled up. And I probably got like a little bit emotional. And the superintendent kind of yelled at me because I was getting mad. And one of the other women on the task force said, you know what? If Liz was a man sitting there, you never would have said anything to her. She's allowed to be mad about this. I was like, whoa. But it's like, I'm not a general. I am a soldier. But I can't be at the lead. It's it's hard. It's hard to navigate that. It's intimidating.
It is hard. And I talk about that in the book that maybe this is just me, but I was more comfortable going up against McDonald's, a multi-gazillion-dollar corporation on national television than I would be going to talk to my principal about something, because that kind of advocacy where it's, it's personalities and it's face-to-face and you don't want to step on people's toes, that is, I think, takes a lot more finesse, and you do have to kind of really keep a rein on your emotions, and it can be really, really hard. And that's why I wrote these rules, because I want to give parents some, ways to think about it and make it more comfortable. But I find it very difficult, and I'm not surprised that you did too.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, think of it like an army. You have your generals, you have your lieutenants, you got your soldiers, and figure out where you fit in best.
Yes.
And then utilize your skills.
Yes.
And, being a dietitian for me was helpful because I could walk into a cafeteria or into an environment and say, you know what? That is a healthier food than that, because I had I had the research behind it, to back it up. Oh my gosh. So I hope everybody listening just kind of gets fired up because there's so many little ways we can improve the food scene for our kids. And even if you just tackle one, all those little changes add up quickly.
I believe that's true. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have a mystery question. I always like to, I have a mason jar here. I keep with a few little questions.
Okay. I'm ready.
It won't be hard, I don't think, but I'm going to pull it out. All right. Here we go. All right. Bettina, if you were a chef, what would be your dream kitchen or cooking job? Where would you see yourself?
Oh, like would I want to be in a restaurant or that kind of thing? Or like what?
Yeah. Or maybe in the Caribbean cooking for, on a yacht. I don't know. Where would you?
How interesting.
Yes, that's where I'd be. But yeah, where would you be if you were a chef?
Well, I've never given any thought to this. Let me think. Not to sound like a one note, Nancy, as my husband says, but I actually love the idea of cooking for kids. I think that would be really, sometimes I really, as much as I love like the advocacy work I'm doing and the writing about it, like sometimes I miss that sort of direct connection with kids. So, I don't know if it would be in a school setting or in a restaurant or just in a teaching capacity, but just being in the kitchen with kids actually sounds really fun to me. So
that sounds fun to me too. And they are fun to cook with. I do it a lot and they are awesome. And I'm telling you, once they learn how to cook, they will pretty much eat just about everything. So that's, I could see you doing that. Bettina, where can my listeners find you on the World Wide Web?
Well, so there's the Lunch Tray blog. And then if they want to learn more just about me and the book, it's bettinasiegel.com. And would you like my social media?
Yes, ma'am.
Stuff
yes,
too?
ma'am.
Okay. So on Twitter, it's at the Lunch Tray. On Facebook, it's also at the Lunch Tray. And then on Instagram, I'm sorry, I saddled everyone with Bettina Elias Siegel. That's my full name to find me on Instagram.
Okay. And I'll put links to you in the show notes so people can find you. And your book, Kid Food, I assume we can find it on Amazon at all major bookstores?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So be sure to check out Kid Food, the challenge of feeding children in a highly processed world. I hope everybody gets a copy. It's been great having you on the show. You've offered a lot of good insight. And so hopefully everybody will get out there and start making those little changes. So thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you. It was such a delight to talk to you.
And thank you to all of my listeners for tuning in today. If you love the show, share it with a friend, post a review on iTunes or Stitcher Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.